Greetings. The recent months we have seen maps getting ranked, those weren't really well received by the community. Controversial mapping is nothing new to the OOS community. For example, Hollowings and Hanzer were notorious due to their experimental mapping. Things like Genryu Kaiko and Miss You incited heated debate among the community, but ultimately they got ranked and greatly influenced mapping. However, things were a little different back then. The QAT had uncontested power, and there was very little the mappers and the community could do when the QAT decided that a map is not rankable at its current state. Even if 95% of the community, including both mappers and players, thought that something is perfect as it is, the QAT still stepped in sometimes, even if the required changes were only minor. This is not a bad thing in itself, I think, as around that time ranked maps were required to be as polished as possible. An example for a minor change that resulted in a little bit of drama was Jenny's Last Journey Home map. For a bit of context, back then qualified maps awarded PP as long as they weren't disqualified, in which case the score would be reset and the PP would be lost. Got that? No? Well, anyway, moving on. Last Journey Home unintentionally became a farm map for, well, pretty much only for Index. He managed to get more than 600 PP back in 2015 on it, with hard rock only, which would be a huge thing even for today. The problem was that he had to redo the score several times due to minor changes in the map. Were those changes necessary? Well, I'll let you decide that for yourself. But to be fair, it wouldn't have been blown out of proportion if there wasn't a big PP score on it. I think everyone can agree with that. I know we are supposed to talk about the community veto proposal, but bear with me a bit. The first time was due to the HP drain being too great with hard rock, which is strange, since nowadays maps that are literally impassable with hard rock are getting ranked. It is a perfectly legitimate concern though, since if a map is impassable or unusually difficult to pass with hard rock, then it is unreasonably punishing. Just a disclaimer. By unusually difficult to pass, I mean having to get an SS or something like that for the pass. I do not mean hard rock making the map like 11 stars or just basically mechanically hard. That's perfectly fine. You can argue that a map doesn't have to be passable with hard rock to get ranked, but honestly, you have to be really obtuse to argue that. If a mapper doesn't care about their map being unusually punishing with a mod that many of the players will use on the map, then that mapper doesn't really care about the players at all, which is fine. I mean, mappers don't have to please the players. But then, why would such a mapper push his or her maps to ranked? Wouldn't it make more sense to map for Graveyard if the mapper didn't care about the vast majority of the players, those will actually play the maps? It seems very contradictory. If a mapper pushes their maps to ranked despite an overwhelming community backlash, then the mapper probably has a more sinister motive to rank his or her maps. This is especially true with the addition of the Loved category. The QAT is much weaker right now. As long as the mapper can explain their decisions and the patterns aren't going against the basic rules, there is nothing the QAT can do, even if they personally disagree with the map. Mappers don't have to map earnestly anymore. The main difference between Hollowings and the so-called PP mappers is that Hollowings had a genuine desire to map something unique instead of pushing super quality maps into ranked for no apparent reason. This PP mapping trend resulted with the bar slowly getting lowered for what is rankable, while Hollowings pushed the bar the other direction. The only thing mappers need to keep in mind is that they shouldn't do anything that is against the written rules. And if they are close to doing that, they need to prepare to argue against any reasonable alternatives. If a mapper wants to be successful in taking his maps to ranked, then argumentative skills are more valuable than mapping skills. The QAT cannot really do anything about it, since their questionable behavior left them without the uncontested power they had. They can only follow the written rules to disqualify maps now. Yet, we have the same problem now. Strong QATs disqualified maps that the majority of the player base thought were perfectly fine, and now BNs rank maps that the majority of the player base think of as unworthy for ranked. Both cases leave the player base unsatisfied although a little differently. It is strange that the player base doesn't have any way to influence mapping. You might say that they should mod maps, but if the QAT cannot stop certain maps from getting ranked, I don't think a few mods could. Besides, it's not really a player thing to mod maps. But what if we actually modded maps we disliked? Are mappers really ready to handle hundreds of mods daily from angry players? This would only create a filibuster situation, since players are not really experienced in the mapping technicalities, so they cannot really use the same kind of sophistic arguments mappers do. But their concerns about the quality of certain maps are just as valid. It would be a battle of attrition, instead of using both of our times to advance mapping. So, what's the solution? Basically, the community needs to be given power to influence mapping in some ways. It is easily achievable by using the user rating system. First, though, we need to get rid of the 10-star system and switch it to a 2-choice one, because everyone would just vote 1 or 10 stars to tilt the vote towards what they want. Everyone could vote whether they want to see certain maps getting ranked or not during the qualification stage. If the map is below, let's say 50% user rating, then it either can proceed to loved or be placed back into pending depending on what the mapper wants. To avoid mappers instantly re-ranking their maps, a cooldown period would be placed, which could be anything between a week or a month or pretty much anything. Of course, this system wouldn't need to be exactly the way I proposed, so the 50% user rating could be 66%, or even 40%, or even 85%. You get the point. Regardless, there are many concerns about this system. I've talked to many people ranging from those who want to see this system to those who are vehemently against it. One of the main counter-arguments is that players would target certain mappers without actually evaluating their maps. The problem is that the reverse of that is also true in the mapping community. Bians often use their name and status in the community to rank their maps, which according to most mappers is perfectly fine. After all, if you invest yourself in the community by establishing yourself as a dedicated mapper, it's not wrong to expect things going a little bit faster for you than others those just started out, right? But if you wholeheartedly believe that, then you should not have any problems with the opposite happening. If you establish yourself as a mapper that ranks maps those actively hurt the game, then it is expected that the community is going to try to set you back in your efforts to rank your maps. For example, Monstota managed to become one of the most liked mappers by actually doing the things the community desired from him. If mappers do not care about the players those actually play the maps, then they are free to map for Graveyard instead of pushing their undesired maps through Ranked. And don't come at me with the bullshit that if you don't like PP maps, don't play them. Because you would have to be really obtuse to say that. By devaluing the competitive aspect of the game, the lifespan of Oath decreases drastically. Competitiveness is one of the most important factors regarding a game's lifespan. Another concern against the community veto system is that players, especially inexperienced ones, do not have enough mapping knowledge in order to evaluate the maps. This, quite frankly, is irrelevant. The standards for players on what makes a map good is very different from mappers. They don't need to explain why they don't like a map, because the only thing that matters for players is the intrinsic enjoyment. If players feel strongly against certain types of maps, like PP maps, then they are perfectly qualified to veto them from being ranked. The ranked section is made for players. A map can still be uploaded and maintained on the site without it being ranked. Some people might worry though that this system would stop not only the maps that are aimed to abuse the PP system or the drop in mapping quality from getting ranked, but also the so-called technical maps. I feel like experimental and technical mapping are in a pretty good spot right now regarding player perception. I would have agreed with this point back in 2014, but nowadays, not so much. Obviously there will be some 5 and 6 digits those are unhappy with their favorite songs not being ranked with the most playable map design, But if we consider how much reach high-level players have on Twitch and Twitter, then I don't think genuinely good experimental maps will ever get a community veto. However, I agree that not everyone should have the same access to voting, if it can lead to a map being blocked from being ranked. Obviously, a 6-digit player with 40 hours of gameplay should make less of an impact than a player with thousands of gameplay hours and community involvement. On top of that, some might say that top players would have too much power with their army of scrubs they can manipulate. To mitigate these issues, there could be limits. Those restrict how many times players could vote for qualified maps per week or per month. For example, after 24 hours of gameplay, you could get your first vote. There could be milestones after certain played hours, those grant additional votes. Other factors could be taken into account like rank, age of the account, or total score to diversify the requirements. To sum it up in an example, a rank 1k player with 1700 hours of playtime and a 5 years old account may have a total of 25 votes per month. In comparison, a rank 100k player with 50 hours of playtime and a 1-year-old account may only have 2 votes. Obviously, these numbers are only minor details of the whole system. They could be tweaked or removed completely, but I believe we need something akin to a community veto system in order to improve mapping quality at this time. 50% is an incredibly low bar to hit with the user rating. Out of the tens of thousands of maps, there are only a handful below 50% user rating, and most of them aren't even in standard mode, though that's a topic for another day. Mappers, those are genuine in their mapping endeavors, would not be affected by this at all. This would only hinder mappers, those are not earnest with their mapping, or the occasional map that steps out of the line in some ways. This system would be only a problem to those who know that their maps are not supposed to be ranked, but by crafting cleverly worded explanations to justify their decisions, they push it through anyway. All this just to have a chuckle among each other. OS is supposed to be a community-driven game, but until the community seizes the means of map production, this couldn't be farther from truth.